So I did a blog post recently called 10 Years Apart, and it was a slightly reflective piece, basically looking at what I did 10 years ago, what I'm doing now, and probably what I'll be doing in 10 years' time. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. If you're interested in learning more about BetAngel, its tools and the opportunities they present, then why not visit betangel.com today and download a free trial. So yeah, before every major meeting, I go into my archives and have a look and compare previous years, and I now have a significant amount of data over a huge amount of time. And when you look at this sort of stuff, you realize that you can have a comparison between what you were doing then and what you're doing now, and how it's subtly shifted over time. So as markets develop, you sort of change with them and you modify stuff that you do. But having that data allows you to do a direct comparison to how you were doing and back then versus now. So if you go back 10 years ago, I actually posted, amusingly, for reasons that you will learn in a second, on the blog my Grand National P&L from 10 years ago, and it was just under £1,000. And I remember kicking myself at that point, thinking that I just failed for the first time ever to get £1,000 from the Grand. And that was like incredibly annoying, because I'd geared up on that day to do whatever I could to try and hit that number, and I just fell short of it just by a tiny amount. And I remember being so annoyed at that. And when I saw that, I just thought, I'll blog that. I'll post it rather on I tweeted it, I think, and stuck it on Facebook. I stuck it on social media. That's what I did. And the reaction was quite funny, because generally the reaction was fairly favourable, but somebody came back and said, I'll post up this year's result. But the funny thing is, on the same screenshot, somebody had actually said to me, I wish you wouldn't post these. So I actually almost posted this year's one, and then I stopped at the last second, at which point I saw this other message saying, I bet you can't post this year's. And it's like, well, actually I can. So I'm going to throw that into the video for you. But yeah, if you look at how things have gone, it's interesting to contrast and compare. And obviously, what I do in the markets has changed a little over the years. But back 10 years ago, when I ran all of the data, my strike rate on horse race, we're talking horse racing here specifically, was 80%. So I was winning 8 out of 10 races. So I'd lose 20%. And the interesting thing is, if your strike rate is 80% anyway, and your losses are in equal proportion to your profits, then you're going to come out on top anyway. But in fact, my profits are always bigger than my losses anyway, and I had a strike rate of 80%. So it's pretty good stuff. So what's changed in those 10 years? Well, I went back at the start of this year and reran all of the stats again to have a look at it. And if you actually look, my strike rate has dropped a little to 78%, but not dramatically over those 10 years. So, when you look at that, you sort of think, well, that's pretty good going, really. There's no significant change there. But the most significant change that I found was that, in fact, my overall gain, my average gain per race, had dropped quite a bit, which sounds disastrous. But in fact, if you look at the other side of the equation, my losses had dropped by an equal amount. So it made no difference overall. I'm earning less per trade than I used to, but I'm losing less as well. So in fact, the two have balanced each other out over that time. What's the reason behind that? What's happened in the last 10 years? Well, if you actually look at the average stake on Betfair, you can actually see that it's been declining and declining and declining. Now, as a trader, when you're active and in the market, you have to work within whatever liquidity that you've got. So the problem is, with the average stake declining, that means that my average stake has to decline with it. And that has been a persistent problem for me. So, and I easily remember this back when I started, my average stake was much higher than it is now. The overall volume in the market has been fairly consistent, but it's just that individual bet size has been slipping backwards. So that makes it a lot harder for people like me to use bigger stakes. I can't do it, basically. The only way to control my risk is to bring my stakes down. So, that's a problem. Because really it would be nice if the market just continued to grow and we were doing millions per race rather than hundreds of thousands, but you have to face facts. That isn't the case, and the average stake is dropping, and therefore you have to reduce your risk by trading with inside that liquidity. Basically, if you put too much money in the market, getting in is usually not an issue. If I decided to go into the market with a 10 grand stake, getting in wouldn't be an issue. Getting out, major problem. and therefore that affects your strike rate, it affects your profit and loss per trade, and therefore you have to reduce stakes. So my stakes have reduced over the last 10 years. That was the first thing that came out. So if you take it all into account and you strip out exceptionals and and so on and so forth, I'm at about 93% like for like of where I was 10 years ago. So that's not a disaster at all. And in fact, it was better than I imagined. So you end up getting sort of slightly distorted in terms of sometimes your views. So to actually sit down and crunch the numbers was a good exercise to go through. But essentially, funny enough, I'm trading more or less in a similar way to the way that I was 10 years ago. A few things have changed. If you look at the way that the market has developed, it's quite curious, because the book percentage used to be higher than it is now, and gradually it's been getting lower and lower and lower, and to smaller book percentages. Part of that is down to because Betfair implemented cross-matching, but also the market's getting tighter and tighter and more competitive. That hasn't been a major problem though, because if you actually look at the average traded range, it's going in the opposite direction. So the market's getting more efficient over here and less efficient over there. And the book percentage has shrunk over time. So I never thought, for example, 10 years ago, that I would pursue an outright betting strategy. But the fact is, the book percentage is so tight now that that's perfectly viable. At the Grand National this year, the overround, it was overbroke. it resolved, the SP on the Grand National 40 runner handicap resolved at 99.2%, which is absolutely incredible. I've said it before, said it again. It's incredible the value you can get with outright betting now. Never thought that would be the case. Curious that it is. But the funny thing is, you can get much better value now, either from trading or betting, because the market is much more variable. That volatility, the average range that you see between the high and the low before the off, has actually widened in that 10 years. So that's interesting to see as well. That presents opportunities for you within there. So how has my trading changed? Well, the core stuff that I do is fairly similar. I've got much better at doing what I do, because I've now got another 10 years worth of experience, and I've got 10 years worth of data, and I've always been really, really keen not only to be able to trade, but to be able to explain what I'm doing and why. So I've got wonderful spreadsheets and equations and stuff that describe it. The funny thing is, it doesn't necessarily enhance what you're doing, but it does give you a fuller description of what you're doing, because there are certain parts of the market that you just can't work out. When that 10 grand back order appears from absolutely nowhere, you can't quantify that. It just happens. But my ability to deal with a variety of different situations has changed quite dramatically. So one of the ways that you look at this is that my confidence levels have risen, because I understand the market so well now and can describe every facet of it so well, and all the participants so well. That gives me a lot more confidence. So let's look at the Grand National. The image that I posted of 10 years ago was just short of 1,000, and then when we look at this year's total, you can see it's 2,050. And in fact, I think I probably could have pushed that harder, because I didn't trade the last 5 minutes. Why? Simply because I wanted to make sure I was completely out and clean, and that money was mine, and I didn't want to participate in that massive rush of activity in the final 5 minutes or so. So I may have been able to squeeze a little bit more out of it, but you can see that I've done better this year than I did 10 years ago. And that's a theme for me, really. The Grand National was a good theme for me, because what I tend to find myself doing now is, on some of the minor meetings, I may skip some of those minor meetings, but I'll put a lot more emphasis and focus into some of the bigger meetings, because I know that's where I'm going to get those large totals. If I nail those, which I generally do, then I know I'm going to do really well. So my focus has shifted a bit more to some of the higher quality stuff, and there's a number of factors behind that, which we'll discuss in a second. But, turning up and trading those, still gives me a really big buzz, but, Brighton on a Tuesday evening or something isn't quite the same feeling. So yeah, other things that have changed over time as well. I've expanded into new markets, I've explored new areas, I've got a much better understanding of all of the sports that I actively trade now, come up with some beautiful models for all of the individual sports. Didn't do much on golf 10 years ago, but I do a lot in golf now around the majors, and I'm very confident with what I'm doing on that. And my overall level, the scale and scope of what I do has increased dramatically, and part of that's down to automation. You can see within BetAngel we've added more and more automated capabilities, and I've been using that to its fullest extent. So I can trade more markets simultaneously than I ever used to. And changes like introducing the streaming and Betfair allowing you to use multiple versions of the software to stream and stuff. There are no limitations on all of those stuff that we had a few years ago. Has suddenly given me an incentive to go off and do a lot more on those side of things. So I'm a lot busier and diverse than I used to be, whereas I used to be just generally racing and wouldn't do anything else, whereas I'm quite active across a whole range of individual markets. So yeah, I'd say that my confidence has increased, my understanding has increased, and when I focus on a big event, I tend to do a lot better than I used to 10 years ago. But I'm probably a little less interested in some of the weaker stuff, probably because it doesn't hold an intellectual challenge or monetary reward. I'd much rather rock up and do a really good result in one of the big meetings, and that will cover many Brightons on a Tuesday evening. So where do we go from here? Where do we go from the next 10 years? Well, some of that's down to where the markets go, because one of the problems you have is if you say you have £100,000 in your account. I'm not saying that you would do, but we're talking hypothetically here. But let's say you have 100,000 in your account and you turn that into 200,000 after 1 year by repeatedly putting and staking that money over thousands of events and so on and so forth. Then your return is 100%. But let's say you've got £1 million in your account, then all of a sudden that returns 10%. Let's say you've got 10 million in your account, then all of a sudden that return is 1%. And you'd be better off putting it in a bank, even at the appallingly low interest rates that you've got at the moment. So one of the things that I have to come to terms with and that I have to toil with is if the markets are flat or decline, then my money is better put elsewhere. However, if the markets grow, which is why I keep telling people to get actively involved, we want to see the markets grow, it will benefit everybody, then there's plenty of room for everybody in the market, and you can increase your stakes. Whereas in fact, as I mentioned earlier in the video, average stakes have decreased, and probably the market's been generally flat on a lot of these events. If we look at the Grand National again, that was slightly higher than 10 years ago, but it was lower than recent years, when in fact it really should be 30, 40, 50 million. If it was that size, can you imagine what you could do in the markets? So I'm going to continue to be an advocate for exchanges, because for the benefit of everybody in the market, whatever niche you occupy, however you want to do it, it's obviously in all our benefit if we see the exchanges grow. However, if they don't grow and I get stuck at roughly the same value year on year, then as a percentage return on capital available to me, it's going to decline. So what's the answer to that? Well, it's quite simple actually, and that is that with my children getting older, I'm pretty sure that it will be more important to them to earn a bit of money from Tuesday on Brighton on a Tuesday evening than it will be for me. So, I continue that process of looking to find ways. You could say something like, hey, why didn't you just automate it, Peter? Well, that's a bit too simplistic, because in fact, the one thing that hasn't changed over all these years is a lot of trading that I do is still completely manual. And in fact, having oversight on something, even if you do automate it, is quite important as well, as the US Masters and other unusual events have showed us. It's amazing how often you can pick up and act on something very quickly before anybody else has spotted it. So necessarily I think that actually handing on my legacy is probably one of the things that will happen in the next 10 years. Because if you think about the stage I'm at with my life, I'm beginning to think now about what can I achieve before I'm too old to achieve it. It's a funny place to be, but I'm beginning to think about all those dreams and things that I had. I've gone down the list over the last few years and ticked off a lot of the items on the bucket list, but there are still a few left, and I'm beginning to focus very heavily now on the ones that are quite difficult to achieve, that I've got to give a real good shot at. So I think it's inevitable that I'll probably spend a bit more time focusing on that and looking to see what I can do there. But I'm happy to do that. I've been very lucky so far. I intend to continue to ride that luck as much as possible. And I really find it difficult when you have weekends like the Grand National weekend. I find it really difficult to conceive of a time when I won't actively trade that. I guess there may be that time. And all those big major meetings, I really enjoy trading. And I can't imagine that there will be a time when I don't actively do that, because I just enjoy it, and I enjoy the analysis and everything around it. It's, I get quite fired up with that. But however, time and tide waits for no man. I have to start thinking about what I want to achieve in that next 10 years. I don't want to reach 60 and find that I haven't achieved a lot of those things, or I become bitter, and I don't want to get to that stage and realise that in fact I've missed out on a few things. So it's careful planning for me over the next 10 years or so. But hopefully I've got a legacy to hand on that other people, you, my children, other people, can continue for me. And I think that that's an important aspect of what I'm doing as well, to be able to hand that down. And everybody has their time in the limelight, and eventually that probably will fade. So to be able to do that and to focus on some different goals over the next 10 years will probably come into play at some point. But would I give up what I do now? I can't see it. I don't know when that time will be, when I decide that perhaps I don't want to do it any longer. And all the time that the markets are favourable, and hopefully if we can get them to grow, they become more favourable, then I think that I can see myself continuing for a long period of time. And it's frustrating sometimes, because I still get invited to all these big events, but I still decline the offers, because it's just much better for me to be sat here. Maybe my attitude on that will change over the next 10 years or so anyway. But anyway, that's looking back at the last 10 years and looking forward at the next 10. And this year I'll move into year 18 of my experience of the exchanges, which is much longer than I imagined. But I'm looking forward to many more still.